My name is Paul, if anyone who arrived late, he, him pronouns. I am one of the teacher trainees here. I was with the former teacher trainee program, and Vic and I are the two remaining members from that original cohort. At some point, we'd like to get some of those folks back, after our disaster, as I call it. A lot of people needed to move away from the community. And some people have started to slowly wander their way back. And I'm honored and humbled by that reality that people are finding their way back through those doors, and that we've created such an amazing community, even with the guest teacher model. I do also want to issue some very important gratitude, especially to Dan Leaf. I think, Dan, you've taken the brunt of the scheduling for this model. Oh yeah, applause, indeed, applause. It was an extra job. It really was genuinely an extra job, researching and looking for people and scheduling, and somehow in this collective energy, through this common shared wisdom of the Dharma, we managed to find ourselves to some really beautiful voices and perspectives. When this is I think the fourth time I've been here in the big room, as I call it, and I had endeavored when I first started teaching here, as a trainee, I wanted to take one of the more powerful trainings that had a profound effect on me. It's a collection of teachings known as the 4 Foundations of Mindfulness. And each time I was here in the big room, I wanted to do each one of the foundations. So I started off with, traditionally the order is mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of what it's like to be an embodied being, the mindfulness of Vedana, the feeling tone, what's the trajectory of the mind, what's the liking and disliking. And then very closely related is the third one, which is what I'm going to be speaking about today, which is mindfulness of the mind. The word in Pali is the word citta, and you may recognize it. It's very similar to the word bodhicitta, which is the word heart mindfulness. So while we're looking at the mind, it's really more the mind in reference to our moods and mind states and emotions. And the last one is mindfulness of dhammas, which is the thought objects themselves. And the reason I was excited about teaching this one is because Joseph Goldstein, the book that we used is Joseph Goldstein's book on mindfulness, when I first did my first foray into the 4 Foundations of Mindfulness. And Joseph Goldstein said something very interesting about how we each of us picks a particular favorite when we start to practice in this way, right? Some of us find out that we are very embodied in our practice. So mindfulness of the body is going to be our anchor practice. Not to say that we don't do the others, but you may have something that, if you feel like mindfulness of the body is your jam, stick with that, right? For me, I found out mindfulness of moods and mind states and emotions was very potent for me at the time. So it became my favorite at the time. But over time, as I've learned more and more, watch the journey inside this mind, watch the comings and goings of the moods and the mind states, while also paying appropriate respect to mindfulness of the body, I've also come to learn that it's almost, it's hard to really separate the two. Mindfulness of moods and emotions is mindfulness of the body, and mindfulness of the body is mindfulness of moods and mind states. In my last talk on Vedana, I talked about this book that I found utterly brilliant. I consider it to be a Dharma book. That's not written to be a Dharma book. That's How Emotions Are Made by Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. This has to do with neuroscience and the studies into how emotions happen, all of the mechanical things that go on inside of our minds. And I found it utterly beautiful and stunning that she basically validated a lot of what we see in the Dharma from a neuroscientific point of view. That that our trajectory of mind, our emotional valence, as they call it, the likings and dislikings, are going to have this effect on where our minds go next in terms of our moods and mind states. And all of it is embodied. This brain, all of these 86 plus or minus 8 billion neurons are really just spending the vast majority of their time operating this body, keeping it safe, keeping it entertained, addressing the threats when they come up, etc. And we do so with this embodied emotional experience. Now, in the 4 Foundations of Mindfulness, the Buddha's teaching, there are a couple of suttas that this concept shows up in, the Anapanasati Sutta and the Satipatthana Sutta. And when we get to this third foundation of mindfulness around mind, mood, mind states, etc., emotions, depending on which sutta you look at, there's sort of different lenses that he takes, that he recommends in terms of how we're going to approach it. And there's a set of steps that I found very fascinating here. And there's an interrelation with these steps, I think. Depending on which teacher you talk to, some are going to say that these contemplations are to be taken in order. You start at the top of the list, the Buddha gives a list, and you go down through the list. Or you don't necessarily go through the list. Maybe you're going to pick one or the other because one is more prevalent than the other. I would recommend for a beginning meditator, explore them all. Just follow these lists, look through all of these things, and then when you find your particular connection point to the Dharma through these instructions, that's important information. You follow that, you work with that, and you work with it for a time. Like I said, I found that monitoring my moods and mind states was the doorway to really settling into my meditation practice. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it's settling into the body, the breath. And then I notice, well, the breath and the body are affected by the mood. And again, we're watching this flow. So anyway, back to the suttas. The first invitation, first opportunity is to just notice, right? We're gonna pay attention to what's going on in the mind in terms of our mood and mind state. Last week, David Sudar gave this really wonderful talk on suffering. And he pointed out something very, very important that I'm so grateful that he brought to the fore. When we talk about the Four Noble Truths and our first invitation to really examine suffering, he said something very important that I thought I want to reiterate here. We can look at the Four Noble Truths as some sort of, statements about how things are, when really they're invitations. They're four tasks, the Four Noble Tasks. And if we're going to unpack, if the invitation is to unpack and understand suffering, right? The Buddha's first noble truth, a lot of people say that it sums up to life is suffering. That's not a great translation by any stretch. The Buddha's not making any claims about what life is. He's making claims about what suffering is, and that it needs to be understood. We can actually turn towards it and expand upon it, not so that we're going to become sullen or defeated or nihilistic or bitter, or to wallow even in our emotions necessarily. But we're going to start to unpack what's going on in our minds such that we can find our way out of these particularly powerful, compelling feelings. So the first one is to hold space. Notice what's going on, right? What kind of mood or mind state is present? And the Buddha gives some guidelines in terms of, he's not going into like detailed emotions like I'm feeling angry or I'm feeling bitter or I'm feeling bitchy or whatever, right? Are we feeling craving, wanting? Are we feeling desire, lust, greed, etc.? Are we feeling aversion, pushing away, hatred, dislike, anger, etc.? And the third one is not really, it's really more of a mind state than a mood, right? This is why it's important to kind of zoom back out. So delusion is the third one, and that's a whole different rabbit hole I'm going to do on another talk about what we mean by delusion. But just imagine, if your mind is particularly consumed with some other false reality about how things are or what's going on, of course, that's going to get in the way of our ability to be with this truth. Is the mind contracted? Are we feeling contracted and tense? Or are we feeling expansive, open, welcoming? Is it great or narrow, which means how far is the concentration pervading, right? How's the concentration doing? Surpassable or unsurpassable? Meaning, can I get past this? Or is my mind just consumed with fear, and that's what my meditation is going to be about. It's just going to be watching the fear, right? Maybe we can, maybe we can't. Concentrated or distracted, right? Am I settling into the moment? Am I able to develop concentration? Or is the distraction still just peppering away at the mind? And of course, liberated or unliberated. Am I feeling free? Or am I feeling clung and grasping upon something? The next one, after we've held space for it, then there's this opportunity for gladdening, right? Which is interesting. instead of just holding space, we can then turn our attention towards what can we do to gladden the mind. One of the easiest ways that we often use in guided meditation, well, it's actually not that easy for some people. So, I was a person who was gratitude impaired for many, many years. But gratitude is a great thing, right? Provided you have the capacity to tap into gratitude. And if you're not, I get it. I've been there, right? There's a points in our lives where tuning towards gratitude might feel absurd or painful or ridiculous. And so that's important to know. We can apply mindfulness to that. Metta, compassion. Direct the compassion inwards. Set aside all of these narratives we have about who we should or shouldn't be. Let them go. And just direct some kindness inwards. Just despite any narratives you have about yourself, any requirements, or any garbage messages that society has placed upon you. Dump all that stuff. Bring some self-love inward. And then, and only then, we find the instructions on concentration. The third instruction is to concentrate the mind, right? It's to gather it together. And I find that it's important to notice that the Buddha tells us that, or he's implying that, let me put it this way. If I, during the guided meditation, if I called up the image of a spider crawling up your arm, right? And then said, okay, everybody breathe, stick to your breath and concentrate. It's probably not going to go great, right? We want to gently and relaxedly coax our minds into states of calm and relaxation, right? And so gladdening the mind has this capacity to then open us up so that we can then start the concentration practice. And we start off with our meditation, we're often trying to concentrate, we're going to follow the breath. And the idea early on in the practice is that you're going to see, you can't do it right off the bat, can you, right? And that's why it's important to notice, or for me to tell you, that's 100% normal, right? The mind is going to wander. We have very busy, very high energy, very high emotion lives. And then the fourth invitation is releasing, to letting go of this grip that our emotions and moods have on us, because we've watched them arise and pass away. We may have cultivated a new mind state, and it's arising and coming and going. Now, in my talk on Vedana, I talked about how the driving capacity of emotions sets us to the trajectory. Our moods and mind states dictate everything about our lives. They narrow our focus. They limit our options when we're feeling constricted, upset, fearful. And when we're feeling kind and warm-hearted and expanded and compassionate, it's a very different set of things can come out of that. I talked about the studies that they did with judges, right? They did some surveys of judges before they were going to look at some caseloads throughout the day. And they presented them with some deliberately, potentially distressing content, right? One was a survey about their thoughts on death. And the other one had to do with timing, right? The other study had to do with when was the last time they ate? And they looked at the rulings that these judges gave. And wouldn't you know that before lunch, their rulings were far more punitive than after they had eaten lunch. And that's very important because these decisions that these folks make have very profound impacts on our lives. When they look at surveys around death, their thoughts on death, similar thing, right? They take a survey on they look at how their rulings have gone throughout the day, and then as soon as they do a survey on their thoughts about death, not even like you're going to die, nothing like onerous, just like any sort of general topics on the concept of death, suddenly their rulings became more punitive. Now, in the study, these were all imaginary, these were caseloads that were written down. These were not real people. Nobody was really genuinely affected by these, but everyone gets hangry. So the general consensus is, if you're going to get a court date, make sure you get it after the judge has lunch. So we are driven by our emotions. We also, in the book, How Emotions Are Made, Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett also talked about, we think we are very rational beings. And our rational mind, if we want to consider where the rational mind kicks into gear, it's really in the prefrontal cortex. It's in our capacity for mindfulness. Our emotional reactivity is going to happen whether we want it to or not. The same thing goes for our moral and ethical conduct, right? If we're faced with a choice that's going to involve a moral and ethical consideration, we're going to have to look at our emotions first, because that's going to direct how we're going to respond to that moral or ethical or rational option that's before us. I mentioned during the meditation, right? The Buddha also, throughout these refrains, he mentions internal and external. We're looking internally at our own internal moods and mind states, and we're considering externally. Now, in meditation, when we're sitting there, of course, we're doing the journey inward. It's kind of difficult we're not in communication with other folks when we're sitting still. But these instructions for the 4 foundations of mindfulness are not just about meditation. They're about how we live our lives. They're about how we engage with the world around us. And when we're in contact with our so-called other, whether it's our partners in life or our friends, our family, you name it, we have these emotionally charged situations where a conflict arises, or they're upset about something and we're not, or we're upset about something and they're not. And so the Buddha gives us this fascinating invitation to apply mindfulness to the so-called other. And I want to point this out because this is, I think, very instrumental to a lot of other teachings that the Buddha presents us with. For those of you who know my story, I cohabitated with my now ex-wife for many, many years before we finally managed to pull off the divorce. And during that time, I'd started my Dharma practice. And as you could well imagine, the household was not very comfortable at times, and we still had our fair share of arguments and conflict. And I started to apply this practice. So I would be in the house, and she would have something to say about something. And instead of this normal reactive jerk that I had to defend myself or to cower away or whatever it was, I just sat there and I just went, oh, here's a person who is upset about something. I can see her breathing has increased, right? Her breath rate has increased. Her face has taken on the face of a person with strong emotions, etc. And I was just paying attention to her in a very, very different way. And I did this a couple of times, and at one point she stopped, and she's, kind of laying in on me or something, and she says, "What are you doing? I'm sitting here telling you all this stuff, and you're just looking at me." No reaction. And I go, the way I was handling things before was not great. I was responding out of emotional reactivity and defense, and I'm trying something different. I'm trying to pay a different type of attention to what's going on with you. And she just went, oh, okay, good. Now, it didn't save the marriage. There were a lot of other things to be sorted out there, but nonetheless, our interaction pivoted 180 degrees that day. And our relationship ever since has been one of far more kindness because I took my reactivity out of that situation. Now, what are we doing when we're opening the space up to the other, right? This is a doorway. This is a doorway to compassion. She was struggling. She was upset about something. My capacity for compassion was totally intervened by my reactivity, my fear and defensiveness. When I let that fear and if I could just be mindful, okay, I'm feeling fear and defense and I'm feeling attacked, etc. But I don't necessarily have to follow that. And I can look at, she has a need, she has a want, there's something she wants to communicate. This is powerful and important to her. Suddenly there's this doorway to compassion that opens up wide. The other side to it is that when we experience sympathetic joy, one of the 4 Brahmaviharas, right? We have metta, compassion, and we also have mudita, which is sympathetic joy. I was a person, before my meditation practice, very, very bitter. Lots of bitterness, lots of jealousness in this heart and mind. And seeing another person's joy, to me, was an insult. That's how bitterness works, right? But when I can step away from my own contraction and fear around how they're doing well, and I may not feel like I'm doing well, okay, I'm noticing what's going on in here. I can hold space for this emotion, but oh my goodness, my friend is having a great time. The relationship's going great, the job is going great, their finances are great, they had a great vacation. And you can finally open up to this space. The door opens up very wide to sympathetic joy. We can set aside our bitterness and our jealousies and really open up to what's going on for others in our lives. So we find ourselves learning how not to be involved, how not to be caught up in our own emotional mind states and the emotional mind states of the others in our lives. We can apply a little more space. Now, I wanted to do an exercise here today. Hopefully I'll leave enough time for this, but we talk about mindfulness of emotions, and Gregory Malouf, one of the teachers who used to teach here, who has his own community now, has this really great Dharma talk on, is Dharma practice therapy? No surprise that we have a lot of therapists in the room here today. A lot of people who taught the Dharma either learned the Dharma first and became therapists of some kind, psychoanalysts, counselors, therapists, you name it, or people who got involved with the Dharma, looked at this crazy world inside and were like, I think I know what I want to do with my life. And they found their way to this beautiful world in the healing arts of helping each other with our emotions and moods and mind states. So if you imagine a Venn diagram, one of those blurred color outlines of, where does therapy and the Dharma overlap? The overlap is huge, right? This is 100% a valid and an important dovetail to our therapeutic practices. Therapists have a slightly different set of things that they're working on. And as the Dharma practitioners, we have a slightly different set of things that we're working on. But this capacity for holding space for emotions is one and the same. And I find that a lot of people who are either in the Dharma hall either are currently in therapy or they're going to go through therapy. I'm not saying anybody here has to. Some people have had therapy and they've done great, and now they feel like their Dharma practice is their thing. But the reason it dovetails so nicely is because we're taking that journey inward. We're doing the homework. We're applying mindfulness. We're actually being able to face the truth of what's going on in our emotions. And we're applying cultivation. We're actually rewiring our brains. We're opening ourselves up to compassion, sympathetic joy. We're letting that bitterness and jealousy attenuate. The main difference, as Gregory says in his Dharma talk from, I think it was 1.5 years ago, is that a therapist is going to want to help you create a healthy self. That's first and foremost, right? And the selves that have shown up in this world into adulthood have had untold amounts of conditioning, all kinds of problems and challenges and frustrations and bad messaging, whether it's from our families or from society, all of this conditioning, this massive conditioning that shows up in a conditioned being. So we get to do the homework, and we get to do it in community. We get to learn from each other, and we get to learn through each other. I want to make one quick comment about, I'm going to split hairs a little bit on semantics. You may hear from a certain mindfulness communities or from the Stoic communities, this idea of controlling your emotions. And maybe this is my connotation of the word, but I don't know if control is a good word to use when we're talking about how we're responding with our emotional moods and mind states. To me, control means like if I'm operating a vehicle, right? I have a very detailed and specific high expectation of if I turn the wheel this way, the car is going to go that way, provided, of course, the car is in good working order, right? If I turn the wheel that way, it's going to move that way. If I brake, it's going to slow down. The Buddha tells us, are you really controlling your emotions? These things come out of the subconscious. These emotions are come out of the stored repository of our conditioning. This body of, sometimes we call it our past karma, but in terms of how it resides in our hearts and minds, how our minds have wired a certain way, we've developed these personalities, these cultures, these identities, etc. All of these things are this storehouse of how we're going to respond in the given moment. So our emotions come out of the subconscious, and that's why we find ourselves really, in my opinion, really more managing our emotions. I also love the word metabolize, right? They're going to come up. They're going to have an effect on how we're going to behave. Let's give it some space. And it's hard. It's super hard. Sometimes these emotions are super, super powerful. Many of us have to deal with ADHD, post-traumatic stress disorder, other trauma-related grief situations. When those emotions hit, they're just going to hit. There have been many times over the years as I've sat here, I've come up out of the meditation, and I just kind of glance over at the other folks in the room, and Sometimes there are tears streaming down people's faces. They're sitting there quiet. They're doing the work. They're not railing or ranting or freaking out, but those tears hit. And it's okay to hold space for those tears. We have to, because if we don't, they're just going to wait till some other time that's less opportune, and they're just going to hit us like a ton of bricks. So I like the idea of metabolizing our emotions, giving space. And we feel overwhelmed, right? People with PTSD, I'm learning some emotions just hit a little bit harder. Our dopamine kind of does a thing, and our adrenaline does another thing. We all have such different physiologies. We all have such different conditioning. And when it comes to the conditioning, I wanted to talk about something very important that I realized as I'm reading this. Some years ago, we read here for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, we read the book Waking Up White. And Debbie Irving was an educator. She still is an educator, I think. But she comes from a particular background. She came from a particular culture, mostly white culture in New England. But she wanted very much to be an educator. She very, very much wanted to be able to reach out and help the students in her classes. And she had ended up with very diverse populations in her classes. And she came up against a whole slew of challenges. She had some very idealistic ideas about what that meant, but the first thing she had to look at was her own emotional reactivity to an uncomfortable topic, right? This is something that precludes our ability to have these conversations, to understand what it's like to be a person from a marginalized community inside of another dominant community. And it's at that emotional reactivity. She saw this in herself. And she had to write about it. She had to talk about how her culture taught her that you're not even allowed to talk about uncomfortable things. You don't get to hold space for these things. You can't talk about it with each other, right? We can't talk about this kind of stuff in public. So a lot of us come with this baggage of whether or not we even feel allowed to feel our own emotions. We may have gender identities that tell us, you're not allowed to feel emotions. Shut up and suck it up. So holding space for our emotions sometimes is quite challenging because we have a precluding idea, a delusion about what it means to be an emotional being. We live in this world constantly onslaught by so much emotionally charged material. No matter what identity group you find yourself within now, everybody's under attack in some form of media somewhere. This has an effect on us. And it causes this reactivity, this contempt, and this derision, and this bitterness. And we're clapping back at each other all the time. The discourse is so devolved because that toxic discourse, unfortunately, is very, very lucrative. So we're responding to all of these realities in our world of what's going on from the outside information coming in.